Hello, today is Monday, September 12th, 2022. I'm Joe Schmidt from TC2, and this is Staying Connected. On today's podcast, I'm joined by Laura McDonald, a senior partner at LB3, and Bryan Carriker, a senior consultant at TC2. We are going to talk about how and why service providers make changes to their core network infrastructure. Sometimes they retire legacy equipment that could impact your service or your network design. So we'll also share some thoughts about what you can do about it. Hey, Laura and Bryan, thanks for joining me today. Laura, let's start with you. What the heck is going on out there?
Joe, thanks. Well, a lot is the answer. And today we're going to be doing a little bit of a deep dive on a slew of Verizon announcements regarding its retirement of legacy switches. And these are older switches in various central offices in the Verizon footprint. So in 2022 alone, Verizon has filed notices of switch retirements in at least 24 locations. This is on top of numerous ones issued in 2021 and 2020. It's basically a rolling process, but some of these changes are happening right now. For example, Verizon has started the steps to shut down a legacy switch in Medina, New York, and move that traffic to a Buffalo switch. Switches in Freehold and Rochelle Park, New Jersey, are being moved and rehomed to New Brunswick, New Jersey, and that starts in the November timeframe. And then just last month, Verizon gave a similar notice for a switch in Albany and in Bridgeville, PA, with that traffic being moved in early 2023. So carriers who are connecting to the retired switches, they're going to need to secure new trunk groups built to the new switch or have existing trunk groups to that switch augmented. Carriers that have direct end office trunks with access connectivity in the new switch location will be required to reposition the codes to the new switch. And then NPA, NCCs will need to be rehomed to that new switch. So there's a lot that has to happen for these switch retirements to take place.
Wow. So, Laura, I don't know if you know this, but a long, long time ago, I worked for IBM Global Services, and those types of changes would drive us absolutely nuts because of all those trunk group changes and all the phone number changes that had to be managed. So, Bryan, should enterprise customers care about these changes?
Hey, Joe and Laura, and yes, there's a huge potential for big issues for the enterprise that they need to take serious. It's important to understand these impacts to your business. Over the years, I've seen these scheduled maintenance events go very smoothly, and sometimes they're a huge disruption to service. Carriers do everything they can to make these changes seamless, but there's big potentials for outages and possibilities need to be given serious consideration.
Oh, yeah, that's right. You used to work for Verizon, so you've seen how these changes are handled as an insider.
Yeah, I did work for Verizon for a long run, and, there's a great opportunity for impact in network performance. These are new switches with better technology, so you would believe that there's going to be better performance. But these maintenance events can cause your network to change. If your network requires design latency, like you have a trading floor or something like that in a financial institution, closer attention needs to be given to those potential performance impacts. Lastly, the biggest impact to the enterprise diversity, when they replace these switches, they're moving from one circuit to another. And there's for sure, no doubt, grooming going on. The enterprises pay dearly for diversity, and that diversity is only promised really the day it's implemented in most cases. Companies need to be aware diversity is potentially up for grabs when these switch changes are implemented and these scheduled maintenance events happen.
Wow, Laura, that sounds like bad news for enterprises.
Well, Joe, it's not all bad news. There are obvious potential risk and service impacts, and Bryan's mentioned some of those. But we want the networks to be modernized. We just want it to be done in a way that minimizes the adverse impact. For some context, many of the switches that are being retired are legacy 5ESS or EWSD type switches. The 5ESS switch came into service in 1982, and the last ones were produced in 2003. The EWSD switch, which is one of the switches being transitioned in Freehold, New Jersey, was introduced in 1986. A lot's happened in telecommunications technology since the early 80s. So it's not the upgrade that creates the issues, it's how they're implemented and how they impact end users that the enterprises need to pay attention to and to make sure that their providers are paying attention to it.
Okay, Bryan, what should enterprises do?
I mean, Joe and Laura, I've thought about this because this is a hard issue. It really is, because it's work that the carriers, in truth, they need to be able to do it. As Laura just said, these are old switches. They need to be upgraded. So they need to do it, but they need to get engaged with their notification process. The carriers all have notification processes, and you can subscribe to those notification services based on a circuit's path or location, and the announcement will come automatically to you with timing so that you can make some decisions. You know, the first thing to do is stay informed, to get informed about what's going on. You need to understand that when they move these switches and move circuits, your network is going to go down. You need to test for your redundancy to make sure your redundancy and failover is working good. And then they're going to give you a time window when that's going to happen in the notice. You need to plan that downtime. You need to notify your internal teams so they can plan accordingly, so they don't have projects, implementations going on or things like that at the same time. And another thing to consider is with your account teams, make sure they're informed and engaged. They're really there to be advocates on your behalf, and you want to make sure they're engaged and they can keep those impacts at a minimum. If it's a smaller scheduled maintenance event, your account team can even advocate on your behalf to have those events moved to a more favorable date if you're able to plan that ahead of time. So I would say the most critical thing that an enterprise needs to do is work with your account team to make sure there's a diversity assurance plan. You pay for the diversity, but let's be honest, that diversity is not a one-time payment deal. You pay for that diversity every single month. You need to work with your account team to understand how they are going to work with you to make sure that that diversity is maintained and the redundancy is kept in place. You know, one of the other things to keep in mind is once these carriers hand off to each other, they lose the visibility on that diversity. So your account team can work with you and should work with you to make sure that that diversity is preserved from their network all the way through handoff carriers' networks to your router. You're purchasing that, and as I said, is a challenge.
Hey, so Laura, if an enterprise is worried about the consequences, what can they do?
Well, Bryan really did a great job of outlining some of the consequences and some of the practical steps you can take. There are some regulatory protections, but you have to be realistic about it. The carriers have to file with the FCC notices of network changes, commonly referred to as a 214 filing. And they have to give notice pursuant to 47 CFR 51. And folks have a small window, impacted folks have a small window to object to that at the FCC. But as a practical matter, that may delay things, but it's unlikely to completely stop things. And we've seen that in the past. So really what you need to focus in is what's in your contract and what you can do from a practical standpoint. From a practical standpoint, look to see if you have any notice requirements from your provider, whether it be Verizon or somebody who's connecting with them. And as Bryan pointed out, this is likely to be considered scheduled maintenance. So when you look through, you may want to search for that term and see how much advance notice your provider has to give before doing a migration that's impacting you. It may be a very short period. It may be 72 hours. So that's why, as Bryan pointed out, it's good for you to be ahead of this or ask your account team to be ahead of this. You need to look to see what remedies you have if this occurs. You may have some rights to say it has to happen in the middle of the night. It can't happen on critical dates like Black Friday. Unfortunately, because this really is scheduled maintenance, very few contracts are going to give you a credit if you have an outage. Check, but that's unlikely. But you may have other things. You may have substitute services for diversity purposes. You may have the right to terminate if the diversity is impacted. The question is whether or not you're going to know about it. So look at these and start making your plan B. Remember that this is not going to just impact you. It's going to impact your carrier and anybody who's really connected through these switches.
So is there anything enterprises should consider when they're negotiating a contract with the service providers?
That's a great question because you don't always want to be looking backwards. You also want to look forward to see not just for these types of network changes, but for other ones that are going to come as continued modifications to the network occur. So you want to build in reasonable protections. You'll see carriers are now building in this clause that says they have broad rights to upgrade technology, which sounds fine as long as you're protected. So you should make sure if you see that language and if you don't, that any upgrades in technology are appropriately tailored and you have significant notice, whatever you need to adjust. You have the right to terminate if you don't like this or a right to substitution. So those are things you should look at. You need to keep minimum service terms short. This is something I say almost every time I talk because where you don't have a good viable remedy, if you can't negotiate one or there isn't one, your best remedy is to move your service to something else or to another carrier. So keep those short. Include and make sure you have good stewardship provisions. As Bryan points out, you need to make sure your account team is coordinating this maintenance and providing you advance notice. And right now, there's a real push to automation, go to our portal. But if you have good stewardship and account team language in your contract outlining these types of things that they have to do, if you run into one of these modernization issues, you can pull out your contract and say, no, don't send me to your portal. You need to help me with this. Here's your requirement. And then finally, if you're paying for diversity, make sure you continue to receive. Bryan was spot on when he said most of these contracts just guarantee you diversity for when it's first put down because there is some regrooming. So you want to address, particularly if it's critical enough that you want diversity, what happens if that changes and what remedies and notice you have. So these are all things, not only looking at these type of switch changes, but any type of modernization to the network you should address.
Joe and Laura, as you can see, most of the actions here required to deliver success in this space is on the enterprise. If you aren't engaged, if you aren't informed, covered by good contract terms, and holding your carrier accountable to leverage your account team, the carriers would be glad to really do nothing. The law is requiring them to make the notifications that they post them, and it's left to you. The enterprises, our listeners, pay a premium for global connectivity with diversity, and it's up to them to plan to maintain that diversity. It is a challenge. There's no doubt. It's an effort that goes on and goes a long way once you do it. And you have to remember, as always, the squeaky wheel gets the grease.
Okay, good stuff. Thanks, Bryan. And thank you as well, Laura. If you'd like to hear more about how these network changes work and what you better be doing so that you're not impacted, or if you have other ICT needs, you can contact Laura, Bryan, me, or any of our LB3 and TC2 colleagues by giving us a call or dropping us an email. You can also stay up to date by subscribing to Staying Connected, checking out our websites, and by following us on LinkedIn.